Hi everyone, I'm Paul Green. I'm CCO at Godel Technologies, and thanks for joining us today for our webinar session. We're going to be talking today about psychological safety and the pillars of a tech team. So hopefully an event that everyone's going to enjoy and participate in. David, I think you're going to run through the format for today.
Yeah, so morning everyone, and thanks for joining us. You can see other people kind of dialing in as we speak, and then numbers are kind of stacking up, which is great. So my name's David Harrison. I'm VP of Sales at Godel. So I'm going to be acting as your kind of Q&A kind of towards the end of the session when we dive through some of the topics and content today. It'd be really great to get a feel for kind of who's joining us. So if you can pop kind of your name, company in the chat, that'd be fantastic. We'll also be putting a poll into the Q&A section as well, where people can vote on that as we go through, and I'll be kind of announcing kind of where we got to at the end of the topics today. So yeah, looking forward to going through some of the content today and sharing some of the Q&A with you later.
Good stuff. So today we've got Andy Norton with us, software engineering manager at Footasylum, and Tristan McCarthy, who's head of software delivery at Footasylum. We've also got Tom Geraghty, transformation lead at Red Hat. So really looking forward to today's sessions. Andy and Tristan will be giving us some insight into the technology team at Footasylum and how they've adopted the tech team's 4 pillars to ensure they communicate, deliver and align themselves with Footasylum's objectives. And Tom's going to be discussing all things psychological safety and how to build high performing teams, which I think is a massive topic at the moment that certainly I'm seeing a huge trend around. So with no further ado, keen to hand over to the guys at Footasylum. So
thank you very much. Okay, so hopefully you can see my slides now.
We can indeed.
Awesome. Yeah, so we're going to be talking about Footasylum's 4 pillars, self and Tris. So I just want to start by a little bit of information about Footasylum for people who don't realise. So we're a UK-based sportswear retailer. So we're on the high street with over 70 stores, plus on the web, a big social media following on Twitter and also YouTube. And really Footasylum's kind of we're trying to give the fashion-focused youth this kind of a really good retail experience, and we have a mix of kind of global sportswear brands and also our homegrown kind of brands as well. So I'm Andy and he's Tris, and today we're going to be talking about our pillars. So I think the first thing to do is to really start about kind of why we needed these pillars in the first place, kind of what they are and the kind of motivations behind it. So what we found really over the last 12 months or so, like a lot of companies, is we've had to be remote at very short notice. You know, we've kind of found that each team has become really like highly optimized. So we have lots of little product teams that align themselves to different parts of the business. They're doing really good work. They're doing really good work because they're working together every day. The problem we have is that there's no kind of global optimization. We've got lots of teams doing their own thing. Each team thinks that it's doing the best thing it can do, and you start to have this drift. So we're seeing that this was happening in the work we're producing. It was the practices we're doing in our everyday work, but it was also kind of the communication as well. Each team was learning its own stuff, but not really sharing that with other teams. And if we're trying to have these kind of common goals, the struggle was we weren't going to really reach that, and we're just going to have lots of teams going off in their own directions. So what we the first thing we needed to do is really understand, well, why are these teams not communicating, and why are we having these kind of collaboration issues remotely? So we sent out this questionnaire around psychological safety. I mean, psychological safety is something that Tom's going to talk about a lot later, but really, for us, it was trying to work out where are our problems now, where are we going wrong, and then what we can do to kind of improve. It's something that we've been trying to do for the last kind of 18 months or so, this continual improvement of what we're doing on our everyday practices. So once we kind of had an idea about where our problems were, and a lot of our problems came down to different teams not feeling like they knew how to communicate with the teams, that they didn't feel like there was a place for them to kind of share knowledge and share ideas. It was really clear that we needed to figure out what good looks like for us. We need to do lots of workshops. We need to work together and kind of come together to have this understanding of what good means to us as a company and these practices we want to kind of take forward. I think what's also important as well is we've had a lot of people join during lockdown, and those people join, and when people join a new company and they don't really communicate with lots of the people around the company, kind of culture gets so diluted a little bit. And we wanted to make sure that we supported people. And when people joined, they had a really good idea of what we're trying to do, what we're trying to do in everyday work. And we didn't want to kind of have this kind of lots of governance. We wanted it to be quite light touch. We wanted it to be something that people can align themselves to. And the problem is kind of we don't do this is we have this continental drift that I mentioned. We've got really good people across lots of teams, but they're not lined up. And over time, they will drift away, and we'll just find ourselves in a position where we'll have lots of teams that are kind of doing their own thing and lots of teams that aren't joined up. And it's ultimately going to become a problem for things like delivery. And we're going to have conflicting ways of working. We're going to find that our architecture will suffer as a part of that, and we'll probably deliver the wrong thing at the wrong time. And there's no consistency, which is ultimately what we're kind of trying to get to. So a lot of it was about empowering teams, and the first thing was to listen. Really, I think the first thing was to kind of get these ideas down and engage people, so we can move forward. So a little bit over to you, Tris.
So I'm obviously going to talk about what we actually did to get to our pillars. I think one of the things we discussed when we talked about what we wanted to have as takeaways for this talk is we don't want people to go away and say, oh, look, these pillars are the ones that are important, we'll go try and implement them. It was very much about showing how we did it for ourselves and what pillars we ended up with, because I think it was more about the process than about the outcome. So if you flick on to the next slide, Andy. So we started off with a kind of senior team led, so IT senior team led discussion within ourselves. We looked at where we thought some of our problems were, like what we'd seen as issues. We looked at the results of that psychological safety survey that Andy talked about. We looked at some themes we saw from that around, high performing teams and sort of that lack of communication across the department. And we also looked at where we'd seen particularly good behavior, so things that were really excellent within teams that we wanted to bed in across the department. So how could we take that good example and make it work across the board? So we started off with this kind of idea, okay, what are our key pillars that we think are important to us? So this came from the senior team. We sat and we talked through it, reiterated a few times on this, and came out with these 4 sections that we thought we could group things into. We talked among ourselves about what that meant to us in terms of, what we thought was key and what good looked like within those pillars. And we sort of started doing that and breaking that down within the senior team still, when we suddenly realized that actually this was starting to feel a bit too much like we were just sort of dictating. So we thought this is a really good opportunity to bring the teams in. This is something we could actually try and make a team activity across the department, and we sort of share the process and take with us on the journey. In fact, we discovered that we weren't working to one of our own pillars. We were doing this in a small group and not working in the open. So we immediately thought, right, how do we pivot this? How do we make this something we can all engage with? So if you go to the next slide, Andy. The thing we came up with is obviously fairly standard workshops using a Miro whiteboard. That's like the go-to at the minute for our company. And I think probably not just us with lockdown making in-person conversations so difficult. So what we did was we took the department of 70 odd people. We split them up randomly into groups, deliberately randomized this. So we tried to bring people together that didn't normally talk. And we gave each group a facilitator from our delivery function. So delivery managers, product managers, the people that are naturally better at facilitating because it's part of their skill set in the day-to-day. So we put together these workshops. We had 6 of them in total, I think, 6 or 7. Each one of those groups went off, took the pillar, looked at the themes that we'd sort of put together in there ourselves and said, no, these are what we think are important within these pillars. And they started to go through them and talk about, okay, what have we missed out? So what themes do they think are important that we've missed? Within each of those pillars, what are the ones that really resonate with them? Which themes do they think we're either doing very well at or very badly at that we want to talk about? And then the ultimate goal of that was what does good look like? So concrete examples of where teams are doing really well, where teams are really struggling, and sort of pulling that out as what do we think good looks like and where should we be aiming? So that was really the focus of that. That went pretty well. We had some good outcomes from that. And then we sort of tried to take that and embed it in. That's the next step in the journey is we've got this idea now. We feel like everyone's kind of signed up to it. How do we bed that in and make sure people are thinking about it? So jump to the next slide, Andy. So we did a number of things around this. Shameless plug, we're hiring, but it is there for a reason. So we tried to bed it into our recruitment strategy. So when we look at writing our job specs, we tried to say, actually, how does this reflect our pillars? Like, are we expressing in this job spec that we want people who are thinking about work in the open? And how can they communicate that to his interview process? So as part of our interview journey, we ask people now, questions that are trying to align to these pillars to see how well they match our culture. So that's been really useful in terms of bringing in the right people. We had some great success with hiring with that approach. we've also kind of started to build out other ways of putting in place. So we had one of our UX designers build us some little icons that became quite ubiquitous. So they started appearing in presentations. They became Slack notifications, so people could respond if they thought they saw something that was a good example. So that was really, really good to have as well. And we've started asking teams to embed it in demos and in our huddle. So we have a weekly catch up among the department where teams kind of present back what they've been working on. We started asking teams to try and reflect within their demos, what is it they're highlighting here? If they're talking about a tech spike they've done, reflect back on the fact that it was a data-driven decision piece. They're looking at how they can measure success. That was a tech spike outcome. So things like that to really try and embed it in. That's a few things we tried. So Andy, do you want to carry on and talk about our 4 pillars?
Sure. So like Tris mentioned, we realized that these 4 key kind of tenets that we wanted to work on. So the first one is data-driven decisions, and then we've got working in the open, and then it's creating a learning culture and how to kind of deliver value quickly and safely. So the first one is about data-driven decisions. So we realized that we need to make decisions based on evidence. We need to make sure that we weren't just focusing on opinion. It wasn't just the highest paid person's opinion is the one that we actually go with. We're going to move away from that and actually have real informed decision making, where everything that we do, we talk about data. We talk about the data that we get from our systems. We talk about the business value. We talk about how we can get data from all these different touch points and then kind of bring them together to actually make something meaningful. I think what we're trying to move away from is just doing something because it seems like the right thing to do, and instead almost changing it to a bit like when you take your car to the garage and they plug in the diagnostic thing. You can see everything that's happening. You can work out things like for our in-store, for example, the kind of the amount of people that are in the store at a particular time of the day, the type of things that are in stock, the type of things that are out of stock, the people that are asking for things that we can't fulfill, the kind of the transactions we're taking at the till, people that are using loyalty points. I mean, those are all really key data points. But once we start to kind of tally all those things up, we can start talking about how we can move metrics and have these conversations with our stakeholders that are about, what are the actual fundamental things that you care about? Because we have all this data, but what are the things that keep them up at night and they worry about? And they're looking at a massive Excel spreadsheet that they used to have. What they actually, the 3 or 4 columns they're actually interested in that they have to make business decisions based on. So if we realized that everything that we needed to do going forward, we had to make sure that it was data driven. And that's conversations as early as possible about what we're trying to get out of this, and ultimately understanding, I suppose, from a product point of view, what are the impacts of this data and what can we do. So we wanted to turn the lights on. We wanted to get to a point where we're understanding these metrics, these indicators, and really kind of moving towards more like a hypothesis-driven development, which is something that we're trying to do now. We're not perfect by any stretch of imagination, but we're starting to talk about, if this is the data we have, then what little change can we make to change that metric? Potentially, it might be trying to improve the average order value in the basket. We can do these small experiments. It's something that we're starting to look at now, things like jobs to be done, and hopefully getting to a point where we can present back, we believe we can change this metric, and here's what we're going to do. We're going to time box it and ultimately come out of it with a bit more information, a bit more of a learning, but ultimately it's data at every point. And we, like I said, we aren't doing something just because it feels like the right thing to do. So that's kind of the first pillar. And it's very much, upfront thinking about data and how you do it. But there's also the next, which is a really important one, and it's become even more important during lockdown, is around kind of working in the open. We try and be really inclusive. We try and kind of communicate across teams and bring everyone into these discussions. But it's naturally not been very easy during lockdown. When we were in the office previously with these kind of digital product teams, you kind of got 7 or 8 people working together around a whiteboard. They sit together all day. There aren't many monitors, so people that are open, they can see each other and they can chat about what they're doing at any point. And the work's on the walls, which is great. And I think what our mistake that we made is we tried to take that and just, magically hope that it would work fine remotely. And I think we realized really quickly that these practices weren't working. Things were getting missed. Conversations weren't happening in the open, and there's a lot of context lost as well. So we'll be starting a piece of work back in March, April last year, and the same questions will come up around what we're trying to do here, who's it for, what problem is it solving, So these are these first indicators that we weren't really working in the open, because people didn't understand the problems they were solving unless they were there at that point in time when that key decision was being made on Slack or something like that. So we realized as well, it wasn't just about development and product teams, but it goes wider than that as well. So we've got our ops teams, we've got support, we've got infrastructure teams. All those teams need to align, and all these teams need to have the right conversations. So this pillar really for us is about, okay, who do we need involved in these conversations, and making sure that what we do talk about is on public channels. So we had to go and actually create public channels on Slack for a lot of our different teams, where they'd give these updates in the open that other people can factor in and talk about. And we're still kind of working through it, but also what's the right type of communication that we need to follow. So should this be written up? Should it be asynchronous? Should it be a video call instead of just people writing things down on Slack so it doesn't get missed? So how can we distill these kind of conversations we're having into something where there's a real concrete context and a problem, and people can feed into it safely without it feeling like a place where they're either not going to get listened to, or it's going to be an opinion that is kind of ignored. So there's the working in the open as well. I think the only other thing to mention on working in the open is the kind of Conway's law. So it's about, the way that you communicate influences the design of your systems, and we were really aware of this. We didn't want to build our systems up that mimic the way our teams were kind of working remotely, because we realized, like I say, they weren't open. So we're very we need to make sure that every point in time, the right people in the room, and that we communicated in the open, and it's updates, it's what people are doing that day, it's stand-ups, it's all these different ceremonies can happen in the open, and people feel free to join into them. So one of our teams does a show and tell on a Friday afternoon, and people from all over the business can join into that, and you've seen people join that more and more. They can ask questions, so there's a real forum kind of feel.
So the next pillar then is creating a learning culture. I think for most people, this comes down to communities of practice, and it's something certainly we had in place already. We had communities of practice built and formed, but what we really saw was they tended to be the first thing to go when people got busy. So if someone's got a lot on, they'll message the group and say, sorry, I can't attend the COP this week, I've got too much on, because it's seen as that kind of almost luxury. It's like a value add, but not the core part of someone's job. So when you look at that as a problem space, you thought, okay, how do we actually build a learning culture then? Community practice are a part of it, an important part, but they can't be everything, because you can't rely on them to give you that transition of knowledge across the teams. So in terms of what it means to us, we looked at it as being making sure we're making time for learning was a key theme of creating a learning culture, and that's for everyone to sign up to, right? Say that actually this is important, we need to make sure we're creating time to do this, whether that's time to write a blog post, time to do some to start a show and tell, or do a lunch and learn, whatever it was, but make time for that. So making sure that people share their successes. I think most businesses will be in that situation where what you really remember, like most things in life, is the bad things where it went wrong. So it's super important to make sure that when something goes right, it's really visible, not just because it's nice for everyone to feel good about what they've done, but also because it helps people, bed in those good behaviors. If we see something good, let's celebrate it. Let's get up in front of people so everyone can say, oh, we could do that too. Trying to get that mindset in place. Very closely linked to psychological safety is learning from failures. So a big part of that is people have to be able to say, we've made a mistake, in order for us to be able to learn from it. So you can't do that without psychological safety, which is why it's such an important part of this, and kind of where this came from. So yeah, part of learning culture is making sure that if you make a mistake, you can put your hand up, say, this went wrong, this is why, and hopefully save other teams from making that same mistake again. Obviously the concepts of continuous improvement, making sure that anything that we learn is fed back into how we do things, through retros and just generally updating our processes and ways of working. Tied to the working in the open, obviously cross-team collaboration. The best way to teach is by doing and working together on things, and sort of that live learning, that coaching aspect. So the more we can make teams work together and collaborate on problems, the more we get sort of natural learning rather than that sort of forced, I'm going to tell you about the thing I've learned. So I think that's really important as well. And then the other big topic that came out, and this was really emphasized when we dug into the workshops, was learning from other places. It's very easy to become an echo chamber and sort of reflect on what you know within the company, and sort of just really sort of bed that in. That's relatively easy. The most important thing, which has also been very hard in lockdown, is getting knowledge from other sources, the conferences, the meetups, the talks that you'd go to, and get that kind of other viewpoint as well as just self-development, self-learning, then taking that back to the team. We had a really good example of that already, actually, where the delivery community practice did like a book club on a book they chose was on facilitation. And they sort of read through that, took some of the learnings from that, and actually came back to the huddle, the group department update, and said, we've learned all this about facilitation. We think this is really good knowledge for everyone to have, but also we as a community are, we're not experts in it, but we're certainly looking at becoming experts. So why not use this as a facilitation resource? Get us into your workshops and your meetings to be a neutral party to facilitate. So things like that worked really, really well. The next one then, Andy, if you want to, next slide, is deliver value quickly and safely. So I'm slightly biased on this one because my job title is head of delivery. So this one resonates particularly with me. In my opinion, this is kind of the one that ties the other three together. So the other three that we've talked about are enablers. They're things that allow us to work well and sort of make us behave well. But it all comes down to how do you make that translate into delivering good software? Because that's what we're here to do at the end of the day. So it's really important to me, and I think it does take on aspects of all the other three pillars we talked about, but it has obviously some focus points of its own as well. So we talked about being really closely aligned to the business. So how do we actually understand and align to what the business are trying to achieve? That's a big part of delivering value. We can talk about it being data driven, but we have to make sure we understand what it is we're trying to achieve in order for that data to mean anything. We talk about so OKRs is a big topic within the company at the minute. We're trying to talk about can we introduce OKRs as an approach, objectives and key results. And one of the big things about that is, you put in your key results, your metrics that you can chase after to improve things, but also you put in your safety checks. So you make sure that you haven't made things worse, or that you're not, degrading performance while adding functionality. Whatever safety check you want to put in, that's a big part of delivering safely. Another thing that's also close to my heart, due to my background in test automation, is making testing a first-class citizen as part of delivering value safely. So it's making sure that we're embedding security and performance up front and testing it up front. It's making sure that testing sort of continues through the journey into production, testing in live, also known as monitoring, and alerting on the back of that. So there's all these concepts that come into delivering value quickly and safely. And that's kind of it for that one for me. One thing I was going to say before we move on is we haven't really talked that much about what good looks like for us. So we talked about the high level pillars. We talked about the themes within those. We haven't really dug into these concrete examples, and that's kind of on purpose. So I think those examples of what good looks like are always going to be very personal to a company. If there is interest, please, let us know. We can maybe do a blog post and focus on what our examples were. But for the purpose of this, I think it's more important that you understand the journey we went on and sort of go and find your own examples of what good looks like within your business.
So just kind of a little bit about what kind of the changes that we have seen. Tris mentioned about community practice. One big kind of change we've seen is that a lot more people joining those who aren't necessarily delivery managers. So, for example, I keep joining their ones because I'm quite nosy, but we're starting to see people from different disciplines kind of sharing these ideas because they realise, I want to work in the open and I want to be part of the learning culture. And when we bang on about it and keep on having these icons and we talk about what have you learned, what's the thing that you've learned this week? People want to learn from anything that they can. And what I've really learned as well, one of the big changes we've seen is that because people aren't in the office, there's few kind of chats happening outside of meetings. So we've kind of seen week notes start to appear. We've encouraged people at the end of each week to say, well, what's your team worked on this week? What are you working on now? What are you working on next? And highlighting any blockers and things. So taking what we've kind of the pillar of working in the open, we're starting to see that when somebody posts a week note, someone from another team will actually come along and say, actually, I need some help with this next week. I can see you're working on X. I also need to work on X. Cool, let's have a chat on Monday morning and figure out how we can work together. I think if we didn't have that and we didn't have these kind of pillars, we'd find that actually these teams would probably go off in different directions and probably deliver the same thing, but in different ways, different implementations and things like that. We've also seen that our teams, we kind of tried to structure our teams similar to the team topologies book of having like platform teams and then having these teams kind of align themselves with the teams to help them, give them the keys to Azure, things like that, help them get set up. That's something that it's led us to feel like we can be a lot more flexible in our teams. I think having this pillar of, it brings people together and you realize I'm not actually working on a platform team. I'm working for Footasylum. I'm aligned to these pillars. This is the culture that we're trying to achieve. If I need to work under the team for a few weeks, I can do that. It isn't much of a problem because ultimately it's benefiting Footasylum, and I'm going to learn, the team's going to learn, and we're going to move forward. You know, so there's some really good examples of that happening over the last couple of months. I think what it has highlighted as well is we kind of have a bit of a gap in product. So we're kind of looking at, well, what can we do around that? How can we make sure that we think in a product-led way, that we use this data, being data-driven, and actually talk about things as outcomes rather than it being output, and talk about the impact it'll have to our customers versus it being the impact it'll have to somebody internally. So we kind of started to find that there's more happening than we expected across different teams. And we're starting to find that our teams are starting to get a real idea of what good looks like, and it's joined up because we have these pillars, but we also have our QAs talking about how QA needs to be a company-wide initiative. They're talking about their test pyramid and what they want to define as a standard, a little bit like the pillars. Their engineers are talking about the standards they want to see in APIs and the standards they want to see around getting things to live in Azure. So they're starting to say, well, if we've got these principles of good working practices, then we want to build on top of that and build more and more things based on these kind of 4 pillars. And I think what's really great is, like Tris mentioned, we're starting to have the weekly catch-ups. We're seeing the icons everywhere now because people are saying, well, actually, yeah, we've done something where we've delivered value quickly this week, and we've learned about how to make some changes in production, and we've been data-driven in the way that we're doing our testing. So everything that we're doing now comes back to the 4 pillars, and we can start to see, and we're just seeing it happen, and it's out of our kind of control a little bit now. It came from the senior team as something that we wanted to embed, but now we've given the teams the chance to actually take it on, move it forward, and attach it to their kind of work.
Okay, so if we're talking about the journey we've been on, obviously no story is complete without what didn't work. So in accordance with trying to work in the open and be open about our failings, we'll try and share some of our mistakes with you, so you can hopefully avoid them if you try this yourselves. So the first one actually came about, if you just, next slide, Andy. The first one we noticed while actually putting these slides together. So if you're going to do surveys based on the Likert scale, make sure you phrase the question so that good's on one side and bad's on the other, because it's very hard to parse the results if you don't. So that's a little top tip from writing surveys, because this screen here, actually all these are positive responses, but you have to really dig into it to understand that. So that might seem quite minor, but it can make quite a big difference when you're trying to figure out themes in the feedback. Next slide, Andy. The big one for me that I think on reflection we could have done a lot better, and we kind of touched on it a bit in a couple of the previous slides, is we kind of did this as a senior team. We built what we thought the pillars were, filled out what we thought they meant before we started getting the teams involved. Obviously, they ran with it really well and got involved with it and sort of flagged up some things we'd missed. But if I was doing this now from scratch, I'd absolutely try and start a completely different way. So we'd probably better off starting with the conversation with the teams about what things are important to them, what themes are important to them, doing sort of 1, 2, 4 all approaches, getting everyone to have their opinion and their say, do some dot voting, just get that kind of from the ground up, and then build the pillars around what we saw from that process. I think that would have been a much better way of getting everyone signed up to the pillars from day one, and might have completely changed what we ended up with. So I think I'd have been interested to see what happens if we went that route, and it would have worked better, I think. So I'd say, yeah, handing on tablets from above, these are our pillars, you must conform to these, was a mistake in hindsight. Next slide, Andy. So fortunately, the team saw this as well, and have already started working to improve. So within the community practice, we did a refresh, off the back of this, we said, can we reset the communities, sort of think about, again, how are we going to align to what we've talked about, these pillars we've come up with and what they mean to us. And those communities went away and worked very differently. They talked about what their principles were, what their vision was, what their initiatives were going to be, and they really built it from the ground up, but with those sort of pillars off to one side as a thing to think about as it went through. So that worked really well. Sort of doing workshops on vision and principles statements, sailboat workshops and things like that were really good within those teams. The last one, this is kind of drifting into takeaways now. You can tip on, Andy, it's cool. Skip next slide. So the last sort of what didn't go so well was momentum. So we started off with this quite strong, we had this sort of initial statement of what we thought the pillars were. We started these workshops, got everyone very engaged, people were really happy with that. And then we started looking at embedding it in. That worked pretty well, but it's also then we started talking about applying it to our projects that were in flight, because obviously we weren't at a point where everything was fresh. We had a lot of things that were still ongoing, and we started to apply it there. And we actually saw some pain points from that, because, some of these projects were, 6 months in, they hadn't been data led. So we're starting to think, oh, are we doing the right thing here? But you're 6 months into this project. Some of them were more sort of big bangs, so they weren't aligned to our idea of making sure we're delivering iteratively and safely. So we started to see a lot of the things where actually we started hitting the reality check of trying to put this on projects already in flight, and really lost momentum there and found that a struggle. So I guess the takeaway from that would be try and do this at a point where you are starting afresh if you can, where you're starting on new projects where you can build this in from the ground up. And where we have projects that have done that, we've seen amazing success with the amount of engagement from stakeholders, because they're all much more involved in the process of understanding what the value is, how we can measure all that kind of thing, and what the problem space is. So it works really well on new projects. Didn't work so well when trying to apply it to legacy projects that are ongoing.
Yeah, I think another thing as well is that it's looking at what's the problems that you're trying to solve. I think it's very easy to just say, for somebody to take away from this talk, I'm going to do the 4 pillars that they've said, screenshot it, take it away and present it to somebody. But I think unless you're actually looking at the core problem that we had around psychological safety and these communications, that the way we were communicating wasn't great, you just end up in that kind of Spotify model of you going through the motions of doing something that seems like the right thing, but probably isn't solving the problems that you actually have in your business. Things like Toyota production systems and so on, companies copied that, but didn't copy the things that actually would have a culture change. So they just ended up going down their own path. So I think it's making sure that you find your own pillars. And that's a key one.
Yeah, definitely. The other thing I think was, I talked briefly about one of the mistakes being not taking everyone on the journey. I think there's another thing in there as well, which is around pillars being aspirational. So we have this massive list of things that we thought good look like. We're not doing half of them, and that's fine. It's meant to be aspirational. It's meant to be, where are we going to focus next, and how can we kind of continue to improve on these things. That's going to be really important, as well as not try and get everything right. Just try and focus on the really important ones for now, or what we think are important, and then revisit it regularly and look at whether these pillars still make sense, whether what we're trying to achieve still makes sense, whether we've actually changed entirely and we need to change our pillars. And one of the things, Andy, that we talked about earlier was, in time, I'd hope that some of these pillars can just go away because they're so embedded that we don't need to talk about them anymore. And we can focus on what we're not doing well and just evolve it that way.
Definitely. I think the final point is one that actually we just talked about just before we joined. I'll let Tris say it because I feel like I'll be stealing his thunder, but.
Oh, okay, I'll say it then. So touched on it a couple of times, but one of the key takeaways for me of this was that the journey was actually far more important than the outcome. So we thought, personally, I'm quite outcome driven. So I was like, right, well, what are we going to do with this? What's our actions off the back of this process? And actually what we found after we did the first round of workshops with the teams is a lot of people were reaching out and saying that was really valuable just because they got to talk to someone they didn't normally talk to in the context of what good looks like. The fact that we had someone from the ops team talking to one of the dev team and platform team talking to a retail team, and they were saying, what does good look like in the context of delivering safely? And just that conversation starting across teams with people that hadn't even met. We had people joining in lockdown who've never met each other. So just driving that process of getting people together and talking about this was more valuable than anything else we got out of it, I think. So I think that's an important takeaway for us, is the journey was definitely more important than the outcome. And I think now on that topic, it's off to Tom to talk about psychological safety.
Thanks, Tristan. Andy, I suppose before we hand over to Tom, just I mentioned to everyone that we will be putting in the poll question about what's the kind of top priority in your organisation at the moment, and if you can answer that as we go through. And I suppose just a bit of a mention to, I suppose, some of the people we've got joining us today as well on the call. I can see quite a few people that have dialed in. I suppose special mention out to, got Martin Hunter from Product Delivery Manager at Brady. Hi, Martin. We've got Mike Downing, CTO at WPA. Sue Kennedy, Chief of Staff at Tombola. Paul Smith, Tech Delivery Director from Fleet on Demand. So there's quite a lot of people joining us, and a really great group of people from the audience side of things. So looking forward to the Q&A at the end, and I'll hand over to yourself now, Tom.
Thanks, David. Hi, everyone, and yeah, thanks, Tristan. Thanks, Andy. That was an awesome talk, and I think everyone's going to find there are some very common alignments and topics between our two talks. So yeah, hi, I'm Tom Geraghty. I'm Transformation Lead at Red Hat Open Innovation Labs. You can find me online at Tom_Geraghty and on LinkedIn, or you can email me at tom@redhat.com. And if you go to that link, the red.ht/Godel, then you get to a form where you can book a little chat with me about this topic or transformation in general. So Red Hat, you've probably heard of us. We're the largest pure play open source company in the world, and Open Innovation Labs is the coolest part of Red Hat, where we help we help organizations translate ideas into innovation by incorporating open processes, culture, and open technology into the way your teams work and build business resilience. Basically, we help you build the best stuff in better ways with better and happier teams. So as part of Open Innovation Labs and the transformation team, I also work with these fine gentlemen, some of whom you may have heard of from such books as Web Operations, the DevOps Handbook, and the Phoenix Project. Let's get into psychological safety, but first I'm going to highlight this woman, Grace Hopper. Grace Hopper is one of my leadership role models. She's an amazing woman, born in 1906, got a PhD in maths from Yale, became a professor at Vassar University, tried to join the Navy when in 1940, but she was rejected because she was 34 years old and joined the reserves instead. Now, Grace Hopper began her computing career subsequently in 1944 when she worked on the Harvard Mark I team, and it was Grace Hopper that eventually popularized the concept of machine-independent programming languages like COBOL. During her lifetime, she was granted 40 honorary degrees and became US Navy Rear Admiral and died in 1992. She also found the first computer bug, the actual computer bug in a Mark II computer at Harvard when she was trying to solve a problem, and found a moth in a relay and stuck the moth to her notes and made a note of the first actual case of a bug being found and stuck the moth in there. She was a champion of improvement and positive change. And she used to say that humans are allergic to change. They love to say, we've always done it this way. And she had a clock on her wall that ran counterclockwise just to prove that you could do things differently. And she emphasized the importance of people, human teams and leadership. And that's why she's featured in this talk. She pointed out that leadership is far more important than simple management. And they're part of the same need to drive performance, but leadership and management are different things that coexist. You manage things and you lead people. And of course, she's right. We don't lead things or manage people. We lead people and manage stuff like compliance, tasks, projects, health and safety, costs and risks. We lead people through vision, strategy, motivation, taking accountability and responsibility, coaching, and all of that good stuff. So management, therefore, is part of leadership. Teams, people need a safe and secure environment to operate and work in. And that includes knowing what to do first, how to do it, and what not to do. Everyone manages stuff, but not everyone leads. And one of the most important things we do as leaders is this: we ensure psychological safety that you've already heard of from Tristan and Andy. This is also known as safety culture. Fundamentally, safety culture and psychological safety is about being able to speak up, whether it's about speaking up about a critical safety issue or the behavior of a senior member of staff or a mistake that you've made or something like that. Now, whilst I hope that all of you work in environments where you could raise a health and safety issue, it's possible that you might feel differently about speaking up about the behavior of a senior leader or similar. Now, this is where safety culture is one of the places where safety culture, the concept of safety culture comes from. Chernobyl in 1986. Now, at this time, economic and political interests came way before safety. And the plant itself had an unsafe design, and the people working there had a real fear of authority, and there was certainly no safety culture. Indeed, the official findings state that the design parameters and characteristics of the reactor violated the safety standards and regulations so seriously that it could only be operated in a country where there was an inadequate safety culture. A safety test was carried out on the day of the incident, which had been run many times before, but never quite successfully. On this occasion, it was delayed, and the second shift team came on, who were less familiar with the system, and so weren't familiar with the test, but didn't raise their concerns because there was a fear of authority. The test was executed, it went wrong, and led to a catastrophic series of events with 2 explosions: one steam explosion that destroyed a reactor, and then the second, nuclear explosion. Now, 31 people died on the day of the explosion, but it's estimated that 4,000 people died as a result, all fundamentally because the engineers didn't feel safe enough, psychologically safe enough, to raise their concerns. Now, if we skip forward to 1999, this is where the term psychological safety really came up. And Dr. Amy Edmondson, who's a professor at Harvard Business School, she was conducting research into clinical teams. And she was looking at the performance of different teams, and she identified the best teams, the ones with the most good outcomes, that's where people survive, and the teams with the most bad outcomes, where people die. Now, what she found was that the teams with the best outcomes, where more people survived, had made more mistakes. They had more mistakes than the teams with more deaths, which didn't make any sense. And in fact, she initially thought she'd got the results the wrong way around. So she dove into the data a bit further, and what she found was that the best teams were admitting more mistakes, and the bad teams, the teams with poor outcomes, were hiding theirs. And so she came up with this concept of psychological safety, which is the belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. Psychological safety is a group phenomenon. It's like an aggregate measure of the degree of interpersonal trust, comfort, and commitment felt by team members. It might mean being able to run safe to learn experiments. It might mean feeling safe delivering news that the recipient might not want to hear, expressing diverse opinions, asking for help, or admitting mistakes. Sidney Dekker actually found the same thing with airlines. The airlines that report more incidents actually have a lower passenger mortality risk. So let's think about that. Let's think of the best team that you've been part of. Now, chances are that team wasn't great because they were skilled, intelligent, hardworking, although maybe they were those things. Chances are that team was the best team because you all trusted each other. You felt safe to be part of the team as yourselves. And as part of that team, you were able to admit mistakes, ask for help when needed, suggest your own ideas for innovation, and challenge each other in positive ways. And maybe think about the worst team you've been part of, where you couldn't speak up, you couldn't be yourself, you couldn't trust each other or rely on each other not to act in their own self-interest. Not only is that a pretty awful situation to be in, but performance takes a massive hit. Mistakes are hidden, potentially great ideas don't get suggested, poor decisions aren't challenged, and ultimately the team may break up as a result. So we know being in a psychologically safe team is a nice place to be. It feels good, but why is it good to be psychologically safe? It might feel nice, but does it make money? Now, this is from Google's Project Aristotle that you might be familiar with. This is the research into what makes teams high performing. And they did this research in 2012. Now, the Google Project Aristotle team identified 4 factors: impact, meaning, structure and clarity, and dependability, that they knew were critical for high performing teams. But they knew that something was missing because teams with these 4 factors still had variation in their performance. Someone came across Amy Edmondson's paper and decided to measure psychological safety across the teams. And they found that the one most important thing, the one key factor for all high-performing teams, was psychological safety. There's more evidence, though. If you know of the State of DevOps reports over the past 8 or 9 years, the 2019 report in particular highlighted psychological safety or safety culture that optimizes for information flow, trust, innovation, and risk sharing, being predictive of performance. Now, we're going to skip through these charts, but these are charts that basically show that and show the different components for performance across software delivery teams and organizations. Now, you'll have seen these questions from Andy and Tristan's talk before. Now, these are 10 questions. I've actually added 2 here, 2 extra ones, 2 bonus questions for measuring psychological safety. And this is a great way of measuring psychological safety in teams or indeed across organizations. And these, we're not going to go through each one, but if all these questions refer to elements of psychological safety, such as being able to take a risk, being able to ask for help. Does your team try to find the systemic causes of incidents and problems and mistakes rather than assigning blame? Now, what's really, really powerful about measuring psychological safety using these questions is that you're actually doing 4 things. First of all, you're surfacing any issues that impact psychological safety. You're highlighting the things that impact it. Secondly, you're educating people about what psychological safety actually is. Thirdly, you're making psychological safety a safe thing to talk about. In a weird way, it helps to be psychologically safe in order to talk about psychological safety. And finally, possibly the most important thing, is that by asking people to agree with these statements, you're encouraging the very behaviors themselves that increase psychological safety. So again, we're not going to go into every single one of these things, but there are so many amazing ways to build psychological safety in your teams. And that ranges from getting the basics right. This comes back to Google's factors around dependability and understanding and clarity and knowing what to do. There's in fact, Tristan and Andy made a point about being inclusive in decision making. There's a real power here in team autonomy, and I really like the phrase "nothing about me without me." So teams and people should always be involved in discussions and decisions that impact them. Now, that doesn't mean you need consensus, doesn't mean you need everyone to agree, but it does mean people should be involved in decision making. And there's some other really powerful things here, including holding retrospectives, blameless root cause analyses, and those sorts of exercises that enable people to surface mistakes, concerns, or questions in a safe place and highlight opportunities for learning, which creates, as we've just been listening about, a learning culture. And this is what psychological safety really, really is about. It's about creating a learning culture inside a team, inside an organization. There's a whole point here about the power of psychological safety in remote teams, and this is a whole talk by itself, but I'm just going to leave this here for a moment while we look at a couple of things, including building an explicit culture of appreciation, because it's so easy to forget how often we thank and praise people when we're all in the same place and just say thanks, that was great. But when we're all remote, it's somewhat more difficult to do, and we sometimes forget to do it explicitly. There's another point here about using Hanlon's razor. I love Hanlon's razor. Hanlon's razor is about assuming the best. It's actually determined as never attribute to malice that which can be adequately explained by stupidity. But the point here is, so often when we're remote, written communication or indeed video or audio communication can come across in a way that it's not intended. So there's a real power here in making sure that you assume the best of communication, and to allow others to assume the best of your communication. Use things like emojis and GIFs in your communication, even if it's not your usual style, but that ensures that your communication is received in the way it's intended. And of course, putting your own oxygen mask on first is absolutely critical. So whilst you're building psychological safety, what does that actually look like? Well, this is really powerful tool. This is a really powerful concept to think about. There are multiple stages to psychological safety. It's not a binary, you have it or you don't thing. There are different levels. And the first is just being a member, inclusion safety. And this is just, this is just being comfortable, being present in a team. So very basic psychological safety. The second stage is learner safety. And this is where people feel free to ask questions, give and receive feedback, or experiment and make mistakes. And the third stage is contributor safety, which means being able to participate as a member of the team, contribute your own individual and unique ideas and suggestions. Because by doing so, you're literally putting yourself out there, you're putting your own ideas out there and making yourself quite vulnerable, which requires a high degree of psychological safety. Now, the highest level of psychological safety is challenger safety, which means being able to challenge the way the team does things. It means being able to challenge the ideas of other people on the team, even the ideas and contributions of people much senior to you on the team. Now, what I really like to point out here is that at stage 4 or increasing stages through this, team members are happy. Very few high-performing teams are unhappy, but high-performing teams are not happy because they're high-performing. They're high-performing because they're happy. Happiness precedes success. And we're just going to touch on this because the 4 stages echo Tuckman's model, and I think it's really important to remember that teams flow through these different stages. So whilst teams flow through different levels of Tuckman's model, they also flow through different levels of psychological safety. But is psychological safety enough on its own? Well, no, just having psychological safety isn't enough. You also need drive, motivation, accountability. Now, this is a great little tool, a conceptual tool to use by yourself or workshop with your team. Now, if you consider psychological safety on the x-axis, increasing as you go up, and drive or accountability on the bottom y-axis, x-axis, sorry, increasing as you move right, where you've got a low psychological safety and low drive or accountability, teams can form into teams will reside in this apathy zone where they don't really care. Like there's no need to do stuff or work particularly hard, and there's no safety to admit that there's a problem either. But if you increase drive without increasing psychological safety, teams reside then in this anxiety zone where there's a lot of pressure, a lot of competition, but not much psychological safety to highlight that there's a problem either. Now, if we reduce the amount of drive or accountability and increase psychological safety, we'll move up into the comfort zone. That's where teams it can feel nice in this zone. It's a nice, comfy place to be, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're performing. It's not the learning zone, which is where the performance zone is. So psychological safety plus drive and accountability results in performance and results in this learning culture, which is a fantastic place to be. Now, one last comment on this is that this is much like a snakes and ladders game. It's really hard to move up. It's really hard to build psychological safety, but it's very easy to accidentally destroy it. So be careful when you're building psychological safety in your team, and make a note that it might be safer to actually move people into the comfort zone first and then into performance, rather than trying to go straight to performance straight away. Now, psychological safety and its impact on performance is one of the few things that can still endow a true competitive advantage, and it's entering the mainstream. The lexicon of management and leadership, and it's about time. There's loads of books just in the past year that have been released on this. Now is the time to focus on psychological safety, partly due to the COVID crisis in 2020, partly because everyone else is too, but partly because it's the right thing to do. So even if you're not in charge of the team, you can begin to foster these behaviors in this culture by doing three things. Framing work as a learning problem, not an execution problem. The primary outcome of work should be knowing how to do it better next time. Secondly, acknowledge your own fallibility. You might be an expert, but you don't know everything, and you get things wrong. And if you admit it when you get things wrong, you allow others to do the same. Thirdly, model curiosity. Ask a lot of questions, because by asking questions, you create a need for voice. And by asking questions, people have to speak up. Now, Grace Hopper got rejected by the Navy, but nobody had to tell her she was leadership material in order for her to become the amazing leader that she did. You don't have to be told you're a leader to be a leader. So again, visit that link to book a 30-minute chat with me. Thanks very much for listening to me today. And I think it's time for Q&A.
That's fantastic. Thanks for that, Tom, and also thank you to Andy and Tristan. Really good topics of conversation. I think we'll start. Firstly, we'll dive into some of the poll results, and I get your guys' thoughts on it as well. And I'm conscious we're overrunning slightly, so if people can spare sort of an additional kind of 10 minutes to get through. We've got quite a few questions that are coming in quite thick and fast from people we've got on the call as well. So that's much appreciated. So I suppose the poll question we put out to the audience was what is currently a top priority in your organisation, and some of the answers were kind of improving communication, modernising company culture, delivering value safely and quickly, and then aligning the team with company objectives. And we've got quite an overwhelming response for delivering value safely and quickly. I suppose 45% of the audience voted on that. I suppose over at Footasylum guys, so Andy, Tristan, what would you have voted? And did that kind of surprise you as well in terms of what came back first and foremost?
I'd have voted exactly the same. So it's all about delivering value quickly and safely.
Good stuff. What about yourself, Tom?
You're on mute.
Sorry, what was the question? I was looking at the Q&A.
No, it's no problem. I was looking at so from the poll results, what is currently a top priority in your organisation? So the main kind of overwhelming response was delivering value safely and quickly. The other ones around kind of aligning the company objectives, improving communication, modernising company culture. What would you have voted for?
I would say delivering value safely and quickly. I think that's safe and quick is the challenge, isn't it?
Indeed. Well, it definitely aligns to the topics today. I know I appreciate everyone's feedback. I suppose diving into the questions then, guys. So I'll kick off with one that we've got on the top of the list at the moment, which is to Footasylum from Alan Inglis. How do you reconcile the need for rapid decision making with the time taken to collect data and analyze options? I suppose almost so you don't get into that kind of analysis paralysis type setup.
I think that's a very difficult one to answer because it's always going to be contextual. To equate it to kind of the similar problem within within teams and delivery, you have that situation where when do you stop estimating and planning and when do you start doing, and you have to always balance it as the more certainty you get, the more confident you can be that you're going to get it done, that's going to be the right thing. But obviously, as you say, the less time you are spending on actually delivering it and getting out the door. So it's a balance that you have to work hard to strike. I haven't got a great answer for it. It's just always going to be, how important is this piece of work? How critical is it time sensitive? I mean, we have work in our world which is retail, obviously, so it's there's a point in the year where if it's not there, it's not useful for another year. We have this peak period where you have to get stuff out for if it's going to be useful. So sometimes you have to sort of look at that and say there are the real life deadlines, so we have to look at how we can get what we need to be in place by then as safely as possible, and that's that trade-off between we do our best, but we have to say at some point we have to get started on this to get any value out of this.
Yeah, I think as well, what we've tried to do quite recently is we've had a few outcomes, some initiatives that we're looking to do. And the question we've kind of brought it back to in kind of workshops is, what data do we need to get there? So starting with that outcome of, we want to be in this position in 12 months, what data points do we need now to know if it's the right thing to do? And kind of what are the signals of success? Do we have like the lagging metrics, the leading metrics? And in this case, it was about, do we have the ability to know our NPS score, our CSAT score, things like that? And then it was like, what's our data confidence? And a bit like blockbusters, you've got all the hexagons. It's kind of like, have we got enough now to get us to this end goal? Or is there some things that we don't know yet? And then a lot of it was bringing stakeholders into that as well, because they were saying, well, actually, we have this tool, or there's parts of the journey we weren't too familiar with, so they could say, well, actually, we want to send this type of text message to them afterwards, or we can get this additional data points to you. So it's enabled us to kind of, we've had a lot more conversations, and I think we're going to be probably investing in more tools and things around that. Yeah, we've just kind of had that confidence, really. Can we get across the river now? We've got enough confidence in the stones in front of us to get there, be able to make decisions.
Fantastic, thanks, guys. I suppose question for Tristan: did you encounter any stakeholder or exec reluctance, and any tips for how to kind of manage when a stakeholder's behaviour kind of undermines everything that potentially you're trying to achieve with your team's either sort of behaviour or culture? Yeah,
I think definitely encountered that. There's always going to be stakeholders that are just want what they want. You're never going to avoid that, especially when you have very strong personalities, which you're always going to have in charge. You're going to have strong personalities, very experienced, very knowledgeable people who trust their gut and just want you to respect that experience. And often you do naturally if you've got people that are strong leaders. In terms of how you deal with that in terms of undermining our efforts, I think we were lucky in that we had some really strong examples of it working well. So we put a project out earlier in the year where it was data driven from the start. They had all this UX experience in the team from the beginning, so they captured a lot of data about how the users were interacting with the systems we were building. There were workshops ongoing all the time. It was an app we were building for our staff in store. And the whole process was really aligned to being data led, about UX led, getting that feedback in early and being sort of really open about what we're doing, taking the stakeholders on the journey. And we were able to reflect back and say, look, here's a success. Before we even started talking about this as being a department wide thing, we had a success that we could point to and say, look at how well that's gone. And it did go very well.
It's good. No, I like that idea, kind of pointing towards those quick wins as well. No, thanks, Tristan. One for you, Tom. How do you get the balance right between promoting a blameless culture, but still making sure that all that kind of accountability, not all accountability is lost?
I think, that's a great question. And what that comes down to a lot of team culture and shared values and behaviors kind of work. It does require some work a lot of work to be put into working with the team to establish those sort of core tenets, those core values and behaviors where as a leader, it shouldn't be upon you to be holding people responsible for, say, delivering what they say they would deliver. But the team would have a culture, a psychologically safe culture, where they can hold each other accountable. But of course, that extends to being able to put your hand up and say, sorry, I haven't been able to deliver this because it was too hard, or I had some unforeseen problem. But when you've got that level of honesty and systemic blamelessness, where people know that if they do make a mistake or struggle, they're not going to be held against a fire for it, then people will hold themselves accountable and each other.
Oh, fantastic. Got another one here for you as well, Tom, from Elena. How do you motivate your teammates to speak up with their ideas, sort of concerns or mistakes? And how do you build up that trust within the team, taking into consideration that there are different types of trust in different cultures, almost like task-based versus relationship-based?
Oh yeah, so that's great. There's so much here. There's a ton of workshops and stuff you can do. Part of it is just being patient. This takes time. You don't just build a team and suddenly, that afternoon have a great level of trust in the team. The teams need to be small, long-lived. They need to have a shared set of values and expectations of each other. That's a really important. In fact, you can run that as a series of workshops to make sure that you're drawing out what is important to those teams, and especially in multicultural teams, identifying the shared common values amongst each other. And that might just, there might be that some cultures maybe don't attend, always attend meetings a bit late or something like that, and someone else finds that incredibly offensive. So drawing an expectation that everyone agrees on a common set of behaviors and beliefs. And then there's tons of other exercises. In fact, that quadrant exercise is a really powerful one to do with your team, to talk to people about what it might feel like to be in those different quadrants, and then identify where people are or have been and want to be in those quadrants, and sort of moving some dots around on there. That can be really powerful to surface any sort of fears or move the team forward in terms of psychological safety.
Fantastic. Question for the Footasylum team from this coming from Alan Jenkins. What success criteria did you select at the start?
Of the process to build our pillars.
Indeed.
I'm assuming is the context for that. Yeah. So we probably could have done better. The main thing we had as a success criteria is we're going to run the survey again, the psychological safety one, and see if we've seen improvements in the cross-department pieces. Other than that, it's not particularly data-led, so we could give ourselves a slap on the wrist for that. Obviously, a lot of it's gut feel about how well do we think some of these lessons are bedding in. Are we seeing the sort of the pillars being utilized and being reflected? So it's mostly going to be anecdotal, I suppose. It's going to be, do we think this is going better? The only concrete data point is the psychological safety survey that we had pre and post.
No, fantastic. And then I've got a question that's coming here from Aaron Jones. I believe this one looks like it's directed at yourself, Tom. So as part of your learning culture, how do you go about retrospectively reviewing things such as incidents? Do you put kind of blameless post-mortems or similar? And if so, how are those sessions run?
Oh, that's a great question, and it's a huge subject as well. There are some great resources out there about how to run blameless root cause analyses and postmortems. I actually use some techniques from epidemiology called Rothman's causal pies, which fundamentally approach the concept that there is no single root cause. There are multiple component causes of any incident or thing, and you can workshop those ideas to generate what components caused an incident. But fundamentally, there are some fundamentals, including having the right people in the room, making sure that you wouldn't run a blameless root cause analysis with the CEO in the room, because you're not going to get you're not going to generate that psychological safety for people to be honest about mistakes they made or problems that they encountered. So run it well, but also so worry less about how to do it and build habits. So just keep doing it, because the more you do it and the more you examine, did that go well, did that not go well, what went well, how can we do it better, you're just going to get better at it. So worry less about how to do it and worry more about just doing it.
Oh, fantastic. Another one for you here, Tom, from Mike Tong. What does break the golden rule?
So the golden rule is treat others how you want to be treated. which is a great rule, but it's kind of a bit of a baseline. It's kind of a minimum expectation, really. Ideally, we want to be treating other people how they want to be treated. And there's a ton of work you can do around that, whether that's simply spending time getting to know people properly, or creating sort of personal README files or things like that to really examine how different members of your team want to be interacted with, how they like to be treated, how they like their work environment to be, because it won't be the same as you.
No, fantastic. And another one here for you, Tom, as well. Do you think that in order for the team to speak up, there needs to be some form of leadership from the top? And if so, how do we go about kind of influencing that change from the outset?
I think that's a fundamental and very important question. It is possible to allow to build a team that is incredibly psychologically safe within a less psychologically safe environment. But that ends up creating what I call a psychological safety gradient across the teams, and that can be a stressful thing to be. It can be hard to manage. So yes, ideally you need to get buy-in from the very top, and this often means talking to the CEO, talking to the board about what really matters to them, and that might be if they're particularly risk averse, it might mean explaining to them or workshopping with them how psychological safety reduces the risk of incidents, infosec breaches and stuff like that, by enabling people to highlight risks and problems before they become significant. If your company is particularly focused on rapid value generation, then it might mean talking about innovation and how psychological safety fosters more rapid, faster, more effective innovation and a learning culture. Or it might be something else, cost reduction or reduction in the churn rate of employees. But yeah, it's about identifying what's important to your leaders, and because psychological safety will help their problems, it's just a matter of identifying which ones they are.
No, fantastic stuff. Another one here for you, Tom, around how could we build up psychological safety in multicultural teams, particularly if your teams are potentially, I'm guessing, operating things like scaled agile framework or distributed teams as well?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and it can be much harder to do, particularly if you've got teams spread across different time zones and localities. The same exercises generally apply, the same principles generally apply. Getting teams together and working towards establishing those common values, those common understandings between each other on the team, so that everyone's really speaking, not even necessarily speaking the same language, but the same, in thinking the same things and motivated by the same goals and expectations. So it's about finding that common ground, that shared understanding, and that can be really valuable to exercise. It can be really important. It is worth spending time doing that, for sure.
Fantastic. I think we've got time for one more question, and much appreciated to everyone who stayed on, because quite a lot of the audience has as well. I suppose the final question, Tom, is around kind of when embedding a learning culture after COVID. Did you find more value in group sessions or delivering messages one-to-one? Did you find any kind of struggles keeping that momentum going?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it is hard to gain momentum. It is difficult because people spend so much time, in front of their screens and on video calls that we're fatigued from it, and we just we're desiring just that in-person experience. But it is really valuable to do, and those group sessions, whatever you're doing as a group, and it might just mean playing some games, having a chat together, or workshopping something, or solving a problem together, doing a little hackathon or a virtual escape the rooms or something. Whatever you do, the more stuff you do together as a team, and the more you solve problems and allow people to discover about each other and admit mistakes and practice the things that build psychological safety, it will certainly improve. Yeah.
No, fantastic. I think, guys, that's all the time we've got. I think first and foremost, thank you for everyone that's joined us today. We had quite a broad audience. I think the fact that we've overrun is the fact that we've had quite a lot of questions come through thick and fast, which is great, and it's good to get that level of engagement. So massive pleasure to yourself, Tom, Andy, Tristan. Much appreciated. For everyone who's on the call, we'll share that recording with you, and have a great Thursday afternoon. And thanks for joining us, guys.
Thanks for all.
Thanks everyone.
Take care.
Bye.
Cheers, guys.
Thank you.